Hey folks, in this video we're going to talk about how your final grade is calculated in all of the FYE courses. So whether you're in CSE 1300, 1321, or 1322, your lecture is going to have some amount of quizzes and some amount of tests. And we have specific rules on how we calculate each of your final exam grades. So first off, we're going to talk about the quizzes. So as you're probably familiar at this point, in 1321 and 1322, you have a quiz pretty much every week. In 1300, you have a quiz most weeks. So you're going to have somewhere between 7, 8 quizzes. In some of the cases, it might be as many as 10 quizzes, depending on the class. So take a look at your schedule to see which one it is. So what's going to happen is each week you're going to take a quiz. And so, for example, if you get a 100 on quiz 1, and you might have quiz 2, where you get a 90, and you might have quiz 3, where you get an 80, it's going downhill. We have quiz 4, you got 100, doing better. Quiz 5, you got 100. Quiz 6, you got 100. And quiz 7, you got a 90. Okay, so let's assume that in your section, these are the quizzes that you have. So you're going to have 7 of them. You also at the beginning took a policy quiz, which we refer to as quiz 0. And that also counts as one of your quizzes. So let's assume you got 100 on the policy quiz, which hopefully you did. Since all of the quizzes are open notes, open book, we would expect you to do pretty well on the quizzes. All right, so the way that we calculate the quiz average is we take your best, in this case, 7 quizzes. Since there were 8 quizzes in this list, including the policy quiz, we're going to take your best 7. And in this particular circumstance, it looks like quiz 3 is going to be your lowest quiz. So effectively, we're not going to count quiz 3, and instead we're going to add together the hundreds, the 90, the hundreds. We know that this is 300, so we're just going to shortcut and say that's 300, and then another 90. Okay, so when we add all this together, that looks like that's going to be 680. And then we're going to divide that number by, as I said, 7. Now again, I'm doing 7 because you took 8 quizzes, and I'm doing the best 7 out of that. Okay, so 680 divided by 7 turns out to be 97.14. Okay, so that will be your quiz average, which is one of the components of your final grade. The other components of your final grade are going to be made up by test 1, test 2, and test 3. Now, there's a couple of rules with regard to the tests, but let's start off and assume that you took all 3 of the tests. Test 3 is also known as the final, and you did the following. So you got, let's say, a 90 on test 1, let's say you got a 60 on test 2, and then let's say you got an 80 on the final. Okay, so normally each of these tests would count as 25% of your grade, and the quizzes would count as the other 25%, so you would generally just take each of them and multiply it by 0.25. But all 3 of the classes implement a policy where we will actually drop your lowest quiz, and really what happens, or your lowest test. Sorry, we drop your lowest quiz, and then we have a substitution with regard to your tests. If you took all 3 tests and you did better on the final than one of your previous tests, the final will replace your lowest of your previous tests. So in this case, the student got a 90 on test 1, a 60 on test 2, and an 80 on the final. What we would actually do is we would erase the grade on test 2 and replace it with an 80, because that's what they made on the final. So for this student, the final calculation would be they have a 97.14 on their quizzes, and that's going to be times 0.25 because it's 25% of the grade. And to that, we're going to add their grade on test 1, which was a 90, times 0.25. And to that, we're going to add their test 2, which, as I say, after the substitution in this case, is going to be a 80. And likewise for the final, it's going to be an 80. And then we add all of that together, and we get our final answer. So the 80 times 0.25 is obviously going to be 20. And so this is a 20. This is a 20. The 90 times 0.25 is going to be a 22.5. And the 97.14 times 0.25, that apparently comes out to, well, let me double check that because that doesn't look right. 97.14 times 0.25 is going to be 24.285. All right, so we add those three numbers together, which is the 22.5 plus the 20 plus the 20, and it looks like the student ends up with an 86.785. Okay, and this would be a B. The rules for calculation of the grades is anything that is above an 89.5, so greater than or equal to 89.5 will give you an A. Greater than or equal to 79.5 will be a B. Greater than or equal to 69.5 is a C. 59.5 is a D, and anything below that is an F. For most of you, if you're continuing on in your program and you're a computer science major or a software engineering major, game design, you probably need to make a B in 1321 and 1322 to move forward. So you're looking for a 79.5 or greater. Okay, so let's talk through the test replacement. I think the quiz replacement is fairly simple. We just drop the lowest one of all of your quizzes. But the test replacement, there's a couple of caveats to that rule. So let's take a few more examples. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to assume that the student has a 90 quiz average. All right. So the reason that we drop your lowest quiz is because it's possible that you had a problem during 1 week. Either you were sick, you had something happen during the time of the test, or you just frankly got overwhelmed and you couldn't get to it. It's also possible you took all the quizzes, but it's just one of the quizzes wasn't great. So we assume that at some point throughout the semester, you're going to have some problem that's going to arise, and therefore we drop your lowest quiz. You don't have to do anything, it just automatically happens. So that's used to calculate your quiz average. Likewise, with the tests, there's a couple of possibilities. If you were to miss test 1 for some reason, you would end up with a 0 on test 1. And that's okay, because the way that the rules work is if you take the final exam, which is again known as test 3, it will automatically replace any zeros that you have earlier in the semester. So let's imagine in this example that you got a 0 on test 1, an 80 on test 2, and you got an 85 on the final. When we calculate this grade, we're going to drop the 0 out and replace it with an 85. This could actually even have happened on all three of the or on both of the earlier tests. So again, you could have a quiz average, which was your 90, and test 1, let's imagine that you ended up missing it for some reason. Couldn't do it. And then let's imagine that when you got to test 2, you also got a 0 on it. Okay, looking pretty bad. But then you get to test 3, which is your final, and let's imagine that you score a 90 on the final. In this calculation, we'll replace both of the zeros with the 90. Now, you might say, what you're telling me here is that I can just stop showing up to class and just show up and ace the final. And technically that is true. However, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, because in this circumstance, test 3, the final exam, ends up counting as 75% of your grade. So if you do great on the final, that's okay, it's going to work out. But if you don't do great on the final, you're not going to pass the class. Honestly, for the people who end up doing this, which there are a couple of people every semester who end up doing this, it usually doesn't work out. In most cases, they end up failing the class. Part of the reason is the earlier tests allow you to check your knowledge and make sure that you're actually understanding the material. It's very common that people think that they understand the material from having watched the lectures and or gotten through the labs and assignments, but in reality, it wasn't really sinking in. The tests are where we really see whether you're actually understanding it. Because the quizzes are open notes, you can obviously look up the answers. So we're expecting you to do well on the quizzes, but on the tests, you have no extra help. You have to know the material yourself. And so honestly, if you leave everything till the last minute, the chances that that's going to work out for you, not very high. In most cases, what we actually see is that they end up scoring a 40 or below on that final exam when they don't take test 1 and test 2. So I would not recommend this plan, but I also understand that sometimes things happen. You're sick on the day of the test, you're having problems, you're overwhelmed during that time. If that's true, you don't have to do anything. You can just take the 0 on the test, and as I say, the final will replace one or both of the earlier tests. Now, what is not true is there is nothing that replaces the final. So if, for example, you were sick on the day of the final or you couldn't take the final for some reason, then it's a 0 and none of this matters and you will most likely fail the class. Again, at minimum, the final is worth 25%, and if you need a B to move forward from the class, it's not going to happen if you have a 0 on the final. So make sure you are there for the final exam. That one is non-negotiable. All right, so the final thing to say on all of this is that both of these rules that I just went over are mutually exclusive. So in total, you have the quiz average, which is calculated dropping the lowest quiz. So that part is true no matter what. But with regard to test 1, test 2, and the final, if you have to replace a 0 on either or both of test 1 or test 2, that is all that happens. We replace the 0 and then everything stays as is. If we're not replacing a 0, meaning you took all 3 of the tests, then the other rule where we will replace the lower grade happens. And that's only true if the final exam is greater than one of the previous 2 grades, which in this example, it's not. So therefore, we would do no substitutions whatsoever here because you scored the same on the final. Actually, that's not true. In this example, we would absolutely replace the test 1 grade. Sorry, then you'd have 3 90s in this case. So one or the other of those 2 policies happen. Either we replace your zeros and then nothing else happens. We do not replace your lowest one in addition, or we replace your lowest one. So the best policy is to take all 3 of the tests, do as well as you can on them, and then hopefully by the end of the semester, things have made a lot more sense to you and you've had more practice, and at that point you ace the final and it replaces the lowest test. So if you're at midterm and you're trying to decide, do you want to drop the class, remember that if you drop the class before the drop date, it counts as a W, which doesn't affect your GPA. If you drop it after the drop date, then you effectively get an F in the class. You'll get a WF. So if you're at that point where you've taken test 1 and perhaps it didn't go very well, perhaps you got a very low grade on it, we'll imagine you got a 50, and you're trying to decide, do you want to drop this class or not? The question really is not what you did on test 1. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you think that by the time you get to the final, you'll be able to do better on the final? If you believe the answer to that question is yes, then the final will replace that 50, assuming you did better on the final and you took test 2. So there is no point in the class where you can really say you're going to fail the class and there's nothing you can do about it. It really comes down to how well you know the material on that final exam. So that's how we calculate the grades for the lecture portion of the class. It is always 25% for the quizzes, and then it is usually 25% for test 1, test 2, and the final exam. The only times that it is not 25% for each of those is if you skip one of the tests, being test 1 or test 2, and you get a 0 on it, or if it's a summer semester, we only do test 1 and the final exam. And in those cases, the percentages are slightly different, and that's simply because the summer semesters are accelerated, so there is no test 2 during the summer. So take a look at your syllabus to see the points breakdown during the summer if you're doing that. So hopefully this video explains how to calculate things. D2L does understand and shows you those calculations in there. However, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to see where you are and predict where you're going to be, but you can absolutely make predictions. You can guess what your quiz average is going to be. You probably will know what your test 1 is early in the semester, and you'll know what your test 2 is. And from those 2 things, you can do a little bit of math and figure out what you need to make on the final exam in order to get the grade that you're looking for in the class. So that's it, and that hopefully explains the grading system in 1300, 1321, and 1322 lecture. Thanks.